Colleagues, the next item of business is a Stage 1 Committee Bill debate on Motion 22651 in the name of Bill Kidd in the Scottish Parliament Assistance for Political Parties Bill. Can I invite all those members who wish to take part in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And can I invite Bill Kidd, convener, to speak and move the motion on behalf of the committee. Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Back in February, the Parliament agreed to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee's proposal for a committee bill which would amend the Scotland Act in order to transfer responsibility for setting the terms of the funding of non-government political parties from the Scottish Government to the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. The bill and its accompanying documents were introduced on the 24th of June, and I'm very pleased to be here in the Chamber today to invite the Parliament to agree to the bill's general principles. The bill aims to be, I haven't coughed all day until now. Pardon me. The bill aims to make an administrative change to the way so-called short money payments are determined. Today's arrangements originate from payments introduced by the Harold Wilson government in 1974 to enable opposition parties to fulfil parliamentary functions. After devolution, the Scotland Act 1998 included provision for an equivalent scheme, and so short money has been part of devolved arrangements from day one. It is generally opposition parties at the Scottish Parliament receive payments under the terms of the current scheme, although there are some coalition scenarios in which junior parties in government can receive some payments. Under the current arrangements for funding political parties, payments are made according to a scheme which is set out in an order in Council made under powers set out in the Scotland Act 1998. These powers have only been used once. An order was made in 1999 and has governed the arrangement since the creation of the Parliament. It was prepared jointly by the UK Government and the then Scottish Executive, but the Scotland Act 2016 removed the UK Government's role, leaving Scottish ministers solely responsible for submitting draft orders to Her Majesty. So, while the scheme has always been and continues to be administered and funded by the Scottish Parliamentary Body in the same way as members' salaries, allowances and pensions are, the corporate body does not have the ability to alter the formula that determines the level of funding provided and who is eligible to receive it. The committee considered that the Scottish Government, as the party or parties of power, was not ideally placed to determine the funding of the other political parties represented in the Parliament. The SPCB, by contrast, consists of MSPs elected by the whole Parliament and acts in a politically neutral manner. As such, we believe it is better placed to propose any alterations in respect of the funding of non-government parties, which would always be subject to agreement by the Parliament as a whole. Under the bill, responsibility for setting the terms of the short money arrangements are transferred from Scottish ministers to the Parliament. The provisions of the bill give the Parliament the power to make a resolution setting out a new scheme. In this way, any changes to the current scheme will, as I said, be agreed by the Parliament as a whole. Back at the proposal stage, I reassured members that the proposed bill was narrow in scope, and I do so again today in this debate on its general principles. While the bill transfers responsibility for setting the terms of any future funding scheme from Scottish ministers to the Parliament, it does not interfere with the existing scheme and formula. This will remain in place until such time as the Parliament agrees to change it by means of a formal resolution process. As such, the passage of this bill will not in itself affect the amount paid to parties. It's envisaged that the SPCB, in drawing up a new scheme, will consult before submitting it for formal approval by the whole Parliament. In this way, any alteration to the amount of support available to eligible parties or any change to the rules on eligibility would be determined by all MSPs. In drawing up plans to introduce this bill, the committee consulted with MSPs, political parties, the Parliamentary Bureau, the Scottish Government and the Electoral Commission. The responses published on the committee's website were supportive of the policy. Significantly, the Scottish Government has indicated that it is content that its responsibility in this area be transferred to the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. To summarise the general principles of the bill, it transfers responsibility for setting the terms of funding for opposition parties from Scottish ministers to the Parliament. The current order, which determines the current formula, will remain in place unless and until the Parliament as a whole agrees to a change. I move that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Scottish Parliament Assistance for Political Parties Bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on David Stewart to speak on behalf of the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it doesn't seem that long ago we were debating the bill in this chamber with the proposal debate. And I would first of all like to thank, as Bill Kidd has, the committee and the supporting staff for their continued work on the bill. In my last contribution, Presiding Officer, I mentioned that the last time this Parliament discussed what we commonly refer to as short money was the 2nd of June 1999. Indeed, it was one of the first debates that the newly established Parliament had. The debate itself, of course, was intended to be about modifications to both Schedule 4 and 5 of the Scotland Act 1998, but the discussion was dominated by the subject of short money. And it's strange, as we're nearing the end of Session 5, that we return to this subject. So in 1999, the debate was more about the allocation of money, but this bill is more straightforward by seeking to transfer the administrative oversight of the scheme to the corporate body, a move which I hope makes sense, given that for the last 20 years, the corporate body has been funding the scheme as part of its budget. Now, it's important to stress that the corporate body sees this bill as a very narrow change to the oversight of the scheme and not a fundamental reorganisation. The corporate body, as we've heard from Bill Kidd, oversees, of course, the reimbursement of members' expenses scheme, and it's to the credit of both the Allowances Office and indeed members themselves that we have not seen some of the issues that have impacted other parliaments. Similarly, the corporate body operates the member salary scheme, and with Parliament's support, we've overseen measures to detach ourselves from other Parliament's arrangements and establish our own, which in my personal view is a reflection of the maturity of this institution. The corporate body oversight of the financial assistance will mirror to a great extent what the corporate body does with salaries and with expenses. As I said, at present, and indeed since Parliament was established, it's the corporate body that has been meeting all the costs associated with the short money scheme. The funding, as we've heard from Bill Kidd, is based on a formula, and that amount is currently set at £8,926 per member of the qualifying party group. In terms of accountability, at the end of each year, all parties in receipt of the funding are required to provide an audit certificate signed by an independent audit professional, which then is published on the Parliament's website, confirming that the amount spent has been for parliamentary purposes and parliamentary purposes alone. This Order in Council, the Order in Council providing for the existing scheme, has been in place since 1999. Previously, if any changes were to be made to the arrangements, such an order would have required approval by both Westminster and Holyrood before being made by Her Majesty. The Scotland Act 2016 changed these arrangements, and approval by Westminster is no longer required. Only the Scottish Parliament needs to approve a short money order. However, the corporate body considers that the arrangements provided for by the 2016 Act are still not wholly satisfactory, as the power over the funding arrangements was transferred to Scottish ministers. As the funding is provided by the corporate body, we consider it is the best place to oversee the arrangements. As I mentioned earlier, this will be similar to the corporate body's responsibility for the administration of members' salaries and the reimbursement of expenses scheme. So similar to MSP salaries and expenses, we do not think it appropriate as a matter of principle for the Scottish Government to have the power to determine funding to non-government political parties. The corporate body, by contrast, consists of representatives elected by all MSPs and acts in a politically neutral manner. As such, it might therefore be thought to be better placed to take decisions and promote actions in respect of the funding of non-government parties. The proposal, therefore, is that the corporate body should be able to regulate the short money provision, and I'm pleased to note that this is supported by the government. It's important to be clear that while the corporate body funds the scheme, it is for individual parties to determine how the funding is used, provided it is only used for parliamentary purposes. As I said earlier, I'm very grateful to the Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee for the work it has already undertaken in this matter, and I hope the bill receives support today.
Thank you very much. I now call on Graham Day to speak on behalf of the Scottish Government. 5 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome the opportunity to take part in this debate, and I propose to keep my contribution to it relatively short. My comments today on behalf of the Government will be very much in keeping with those that I made when Parliament debated the relevant committee bill proposal some 7 months ago. I suspect some other contributions will have a familiar ring to them. It is, however, important to place matters on the record once again at stage 1 of the bill's passage. As members are aware, the proposed committee bill to replace section 97 of the Scotland Act 1998 regarding financial assistance to non-government party groups in the Parliament, also referred to as short money, was introduced in the Parliament on the 24th of June 2020. The Government's position has always been that it is for the Parliament to take the lead on matters relevant to its own operation, a position I'm pleased to say was reinforced by the statutory framework provided for in the Scotland Act 2016. The existing arrangements for short monies appear to be purely consequential to the need to put in place a range of practical measures at the start of devolution, more specifically at a point prior to the Parliament being operational and in a position to take on such a role. On that basis, the Government supports the principle of Parliament having direct responsibility for short money and for that policy move to be delivered via a committee bill. The proposal may be regarded as a welcome continuation of legislation promoted by the Parliament to govern its internal operation in a more permanent manner. For example, the registration of members' interests or arrangements for the administration of parliamentary pensions. As the convener outlined, the aim of the bill is simply to transfer statutory responsibility for setting the arrangements for short money from Scottish ministers to the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. I note that the bill promoted by the committee is admirably brief. It sets out a clean and simple statutory framework, which is also to be commended. Members will no doubt be aware that this funding, which in 2018-19 I think was circa £560,000, is already provided from the corporate body's budget. The corporate body is, therefore, surely best placed to oversee any future arrangements. Indeed, such a move places short money on a similar footing with the administration of members' salaries and the allowances scheme. As we've heard, the bill does not seek to affect the amount paid to parties, make changes to the existing scheme, or alter the formula which is applied for the disbursement of funds. Rather, it provides for the arrangements for short monies, including the amounts paid to parties in future, to be determined by resolution of the Parliament as a whole. That seems to me and to this Government to be an entirely sensible basis upon which to proceed. This would enable the Parliament to set its own timetable for any future review of short money or to assess the merits of any specific reform proposal. Finally, I note that the current order will remain in force until the first resolution is made under the new framework. Presiding Officer, I would ask that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Scottish Parliament Assistance for Political Parties Bill.
Thank you very much. We now move to the open debate, and I call Maureen Watt to be followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, I'm pleased to be speaking in this Stage 1 debate on the Scottish Parliament Assistance for Political Parties Bill. I'm glad that we've also only allocated a short amount of time to this debate this afternoon, as I hope it's one of the least contentious pieces of legislation to come before this Parliament. The bill simply seeks, as others have said, to bring responsibility for setting the terms of funding to registered political parties within the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament corporate body by transferring this responsibility from Scottish ministers. It's really quite surprising that in the Scotland Act of 1998, the payments to political parties was provided for by an order of council rather than the SPCB, but today we seek to start the process to rectify that. This is the funding to assist an opposition party in carrying out its parliamentary business, and today we're only debating the transfer of responsibility, not the funding itself, where I'm sure, Presiding Officer, you'd have a queue out of the door of members wishing to speak. When the committee first saw the paper on this subject, the term short money was written with a small s, and I was somewhat puzzled as to what we were talking about. And when I realised it should have a capital S to represent the initiator, I thought, I know something about this. Sir Edward Short, then Leader of the House of Commons, was tasked by Harold Wilson to implement a commitment made in the Queen's Speech of March 1974 to provide some monies to opposition parties to help them do their work, mainly that of shadow ministers and the offices of the whips. Naturally, on this occasion, it was vitally necessary to consult the other parties in the Commons. Progress was delayed by the second election that year, in October, but one of those deeply involved in the discussions throughout, as Chief Whip of the SNP group of 7, then 11, was one Hamish Watt. He was very enthusiastic about this move, especially ensuring that not only seats in the House were taken into account, but votes cast for each party at the election were also used in devising the formula. As those who know my father can imagine, I was subject to a running commentary on the machinations of all the proposals, but he was immensely proud to have been part of that process. So, to all those listening in party central offices in the members' block today, you now know where the origins of their posts and the money for them comes. It's difficult to believe that short money for opposition parties didn't exist earlier than the 1970s, but there it is. Hence my ability to correct the original paper to a capital S and my eagerness to speak on this debate today. Presiding officer, here endeth the history lesson.
Thank you very much for that contribution. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, now to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm delighted that I don't have to tear up my speech and that it is the consensual debate that I thought it was going to be. I welcome the progress of the bill and again give my thanks to those involved, particularly from the committee and the staff. And as Bill Kidd has already done, he's laid out the detail of the provision, so I won't go over that again. When I spoke briefly during the bill's proposal back in February, I offered some backgrounds on payments to political parties and their history in the United Kingdom, as Maureen Watt has just done. And I'm not going to rehash those points, but it's important to reflect the role these payments have in enhancing our parliamentary democracy. It may serve as a reminder that democracy is more than just elections. It requires active and functioning opposition parties, informed debate, an informed electorate, and involvement in the wider processes of how we are governed. In a healthy democracy, we should be constantly reflecting on how to enhance and improve our democratic engagement and procedures. In many ways, not a lot has changed since I last spoke on the subject. As a committee bill, the familiar processes of preparing a Stage 1 report for this chamber to consider have been bypassed. Much of that scrutiny and engagement work has already taken place as the committee outlined its proposals. The rather straightforward clauses of the bill and its documentation have, however, been examined by the Finance Committee, and its call for reviews did not receive any responses, and its report reflects that. This should not be any great surprise, given, as the financial memorandum notes, the costs from changing responsibilities from ministers to the corporate body are minimal. However, it is right that these processes take place and that legislation, particularly legislation amending our foundational statutes, is given the full scrutiny it deserves. That being said, as we introduced it, the Standards Committee has not foreseen any great controversy in what we have proposed. Presiding Officer, as the committee has set out, this bill presents a small but sensible change of responsibilities. Consultation responses have welcomed its provisions and its principles have been well received across the Parliament. It's unlikely that our debate today will feature heavily in tomorrow's newspapers, but it is welcome that this parliamentary housekeeping is taking place, and it's a necessary part of what we all do. I support the bill, and the Scottish Conservatives will be giving it their backing again today, as we have done so in the Standards Committee.
Thank you very much. I now call Neil Findlay, who will be followed by Mark Ruskell, the final speaker in this item.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the convener of the committee and Dave Stewart from the corporate body for opening the debate. The funding of political parties is very important to the running of their democracy. I think we all recognise that. And if we want a thriving parliamentary democracy, then we have to invest in it by providing financial support for things like research, policy development, stakeholder engagement, communications, and all that goes along with the work of political parties. And a functioning, effective and accountable democracy costs money. The bill, let's be honest, is a pretty dull one. It's process-driven, dry, bureaucratic. It's not really what gets us jumping out of bed in the morning, but it is without doubt an important piece of legislation, and it will transfer that responsibility for the short money from ministers to Parliament, where it probably always should have sat, in my opinion. We should never see the control over such an important budget line in the hands of ministers of any political party. So this bill is a good move and a democratic one. It's effectively tidying up a hangover, as people have said, curing a hangover from the pre-Scotland Act era, transferring that responsibility to the corporate body. It does not seek to make changes to the existing scheme and formula for the disbursement of funds, so it won't affect the amount paid to parties. But for me, that is an issue. Whilst not addressed here, I think it does need to be addressed in the longer term, because at the moment the governing party, and this is not a party political comment, this is a comment at whoever is in government, that the governing party, whichever party or parties that may be, has a civil service, its special advisers, legions of policy specialists, an army of press officers. Opposition parties have a few researchers and a few press officers to rely on, and a handful of staff to shadow all of the work of the civil service and the government. So there is a very serious issue at the heart of this, and I hope members reflect on that in the round, because things can change, and things can change quickly, and I think that's the appeal I would make to people when they're looking at this issue. So that issue does need to be addressed. The formula hasn't changed for a very long time, and there's been no recognition of the increased powers and responsibilities of this Parliament that have come over that period of time, which requires more research, requires more advice, and requires more work and consultation. So Scottish Labour supports the bill. We hope it will pass without any problems. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I now call on Mark Ruskell to wind up the debate on behalf of the committee.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Delighted to wind up this debate on behalf of the committee as Deputy Convener of SPPA. And can I thank the clerks and members who've been involved in this debate here this afternoon. I mean, it does correct, this bill, effectively an administrative abnormality, or as Neil Finney called it, a kind of a hangover that we've had since the Scotland Act 1998. So it's been, long overdue that this is corrected. And this is, of course, a very technical bill. It doesn't deal with the levels of funding or the formula that's applied to different political parties. But that is a very live issue. And I think, Neil Finney's contribution and others have perhaps alluded to the debate that's to come if this bill is passed, and about perhaps potentially re-examining that formula going forward. But that's not for decision today. Today is about hopefully agreeing a bill that will make that change to the technicality of how short money is distributed within this Parliament. I mean, Dave Stewart gave us a little bit of the history of this, and Maureen Watt offered a really fascinating personal contribution, the personal history around this. And I think it underlines, perhaps Maureen's contribution underlines just how important short money is, because, particularly for small political parties that are trying to find their feet in institutions and trying to scrutinise government when government has so much resources in the form of civil service and even party staff working for it, it's really important for small parties to have this financial support to enable us to do the work of scrutinising government. And of course, back in the day, in the 70s, even the SNP was a small party once, if you can believe that. So I'd like to perhaps briefly just note the difference in procedure for a committee bill, in that at stage one, a committee bill is not referred to a lead committee for a report on its general principles, since the Parliament has already debated and agreed to the committee's initial policy proposal in this case back in February when we had that debate. Now, the Finance and Constitution Committee, as Jamie Halcrow-Johnson has already pointed out, has now considered and reported on the bill's financial memorandum. It didn't receive any views on its it didn't receive any responses on its call for views and concluded that it had no comment to make on the financial memorandum. Meanwhile, the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee is also required to report at this stage and examine the resolution-making process at Section 1 of the bill, which replaces the current provision for payments to registered political parties. The committee indicated that it was content with the proposed resolution-making power. So, in concluding, Presiding Officer, there is, of course, a strong consensus on the general principles of this bill, namely that it is appropriate that the responsibility should be transferred to the Parliament for setting the terms of the funding for non-government political parties, that it is logical and consistent that the Parliament should have this responsibility, as the scheme has always been administered by the SPCB, and that the SPCB as a politically neutral body is the most appropriate body to propose any alteration in respect of funding. And I welcomed the support, obviously, from the government for that position as well. And finally, that any change in funding is subject to the agreement of the whole Parliament. So I'm pleased to close this debate on behalf of the committee, delighted that we've got the opportunity to take this bill through stage 1 and confirm that I seek the Parliament's agreement on the general principles of this committee bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the stage 1 debate on the Scottish Parliament Assistance for Political Parties Bill, and we will move on in a moment to the next item of business.